the mess that they've found themselves in is because they haven't thought through the consequences of devolution as it currently stands, because for local political reasons, Labour's chosen to adopt really quite different positions as devolution has developed, and they've been caught out with the inconsistencies of that. So you see the contortions that the Scottish Labour Party's got itself into trying to explain away Andy Burnham's remarks, for example. I mean, that's because Labour's health spokesman is reacting to politics in England about the health service, where they've got...
And in Wales.
And in Wales, and a particular trajectory which Labour governments have set themselves down. But in Scotland, under even the previous Labour Liberal Democrat executive, they took very different choices. And now when it comes to the crunch, they're finding it hard to explain that to people. And they find it really difficult to see things outside this kind of electoral type politics and talk about first principles, really, which is what the independence referendum campaign is more and more about.
And actually, in terms of the nuts and bolts, this is also about Labour voters, isn't it? And we're talking about independence and the SNP, but the reality of winning and losing this is about hearts and minds of what are essentially Labour folk.
Well, do you know, I think it's actually even more complex than that. I think it's about the hearts and minds of a really big section of the Scottish electorate, which is naturally left of centre, but has been quite politically sophisticated in recent years. So these are people who are quite happy to vote differently in a Scottish election than a UK election, for example, because they look and they see what's on offer and they think about who is going to best represent their wishes, their views, their desires in the chamber which is up for election at that time. And one of Labour's other big mistakes is that really isn't translating into the referendum campaign anymore. Miliband's speech yesterday was exactly the same one that he could have made going up to visit a really safe by-election seat. There was absolutely no understanding, as it appeared to me at least, that he was engaging in something that's completely different. And so I don't just think it's about the battle for nominally Labour voters, it's a battle for people that have become actually quite astute at placing their vote differently at different times to maximise its effectiveness.
Because the debate has opened out, hasn't it? I mean, I'm a Scottish nationalist, but I recognise this is it's gone way beyond what we think of as the nationalist argument. I mean, this has become about power, about control, about practical democracy, how people get engaged with that, understanding how decisions are made, your territory, and why. And
well, of course, it's about power. Part of that. That's absolutely what it's about. It's about who has power, who represents us, and who's best placed to use that power to do the things that we want them to achieve. And one of the best and I think most honest things I've read this week was Fraser Nelson, I think in today or yesterday's Spectator.
You're quoting the right wing now.
Well, I am, because when they realise that things are not going their way, there's this remarkable flash of honesty that came out in Fraser's writing today, and he said, the breakup of Britain would lead to this massive loss of power and prestige for the remaining UK. And he's absolutely right, because it's the kind of power and prestige that leads Fraser and other people on his side of the argument to want a particular kind of British nationalism, which they're now worrying is going to disappear. But in Scotland, we've got the choice about what kind of power and prestige do we want. So, to use the classic example, is it the power and prestige which goes with Security Council membership and nuclear submarines, or is it the power and prestige of having a well-functioning, fair, egalitarian and prosperous society? So you place your vote, you pay your money, you take your choice.
On the issue of the economy generally, there's been some interesting stuff going on. There was a good report out I saw in part of the Financial Times, which was referring to the importance that Scotland's economy, and particularly the exports, makes to the balance of payments in the UK. And if we left that, the difficulties it would cause for the rest of the UK, which is, it's a kind of almost like a subterranean level of debate, but I think it probably does motivate the real drive and desire in London to hold on to Scotland. Because people keep saying, if we're such a basket case, why do you want to keep us?
Well, absolutely. And one of the things that surprises me about the debate, to be honest, is how there's been relatively little critical examination of the state of the UK economy. Because there's a media narrative which is about the recovery, whatever that is, but it's largely a jobless recovery. It's built on debt again, and it's largely built on rising property prices, and we all know how well that worked out last time.
I think the FT said we're probably one economic shock away from another disaster.
I mean, that may well be true, and to me at least, I think it's quite clear that Osborne's political tactics are really quite astute, as he tries to build just a big enough housing boom in just the right places in time for the UK election. But this is not good macroeconomic management, and the fundamental problems haven't gone away. McKinsey says that the UK is the second most indebted major economy in the world, and that's all debt. That's not just the public debt figure that the
This
UK
is
government
private
likes
debt.
to
People
float.
living on debt.
Well, of
actually.
course it is, but then we've got so much of the economy that's been privatised, not just the off-balance sheet accounting tricks of PFI or whatever, and how we can move them around. Although, of course, interestingly, like Network Rail just the other week, sometimes they have to come back to bite you and come back into the public sector when the auditors realise that these tricks have their limits. But if you look across the economy, another great example, student loans, not a public debt in many respects, but it's real for people that have got very large debts coming out of university. So look across the whole of the economy. Britain's a massively indebted society, and what do we do about it at the moment? We just continually try to refund the debt, financialise as much of the economy as we can do, and there's some political rhetoric about trying to reindustrialise or
But the
trying
debt's
to
going up,
repatriate
isn't it?
jobs.
It's something like £7,000 a second as we're sitting here.
Of
The
course.
national debt, the sovereign debt, is rising all the time.
It is, that's absolutely right, and one of Osborne's failures in his tenure as Chancellor has been to get that under control properly. So, of course Scotland is important to the rest of the UK because it's the UK is a highly indebted, financialised economy, and losing a very significant part of its resource base would be really bad for it.
Mm. On the other hand, as we've shared these islands for a long time, I mean, while I want independence for Scotland, I don't want to trash the British economy. I don't want the people in England, where half my family come from, to suffer because of it. So although there's no doubt how I'm going to vote, if this is going to have a negative economic effect, then I regret that.
Absolutely. I mean, I do a lot of work in the north of England where my wife is from, and so I've got family connections there, and my own extended family, most of it is in London rather than Scotland. So you can see both ends of the economic divide in the UK as it is at the moment. But when I work in the north of England and speak to people, particularly in the northeast, and these are regions which are now poorer than many of the former communist countries that acceded to the EU only 10 years ago. Let's not forget about just how badly these economies in these places have been managed by the UK government as well. I mean, they need to change.
Yeah, do.
And these places and these communities need change as much as Scotland does. The question is, of course, whether a centralised UK which retains Scotland is ever going to offer meaningful economic change in a regional level. And I just don't see any evidence for that. I don't think the Treasury is ever going to be convinced that its line about regional policy being a zero-sum game is wrong. It's always going to focus in London and the South East, because that's what keeps the show on the road.
I suppose as well that if there is a no, then the Barnet funding and part of our funding could be redirected, couldn't it, to help somewhere like Tyneside, for example, or the East Midlands?
Well, if there's a no, the whole issue of how public expenditure across the UK is generated as well as distributed is bound to become a
That'll
burning
bring
issue.
London into focus.
Well, of
that.
Well, of course it will. But I think there'll be no escape of that. But what the outcome of that will be, of course, is anybody's guess, and there are absolutely no guarantees in that. And you're quite right to point out, as I've just done myself, about the intense need that other regions of the UK have outside the South East, and so there's definitely a debate to be had there. But again, that's a question for Westminster. Let's imagine the scenario of a yes vote as well for a minute. Think about what will happen to the regional politics of the UK in those circumstances. One of the problems since 2008 is that we haven't done well out of our crisis. We haven't had a good crisis. We haven't thought about what the lessons of the financial crash have taught us, and I think maybe the disruption to the Westminster consensus that a yes vote would bring will make them face some of these issues. And as I say, you go around the north of England as I do, and you speak to senior people in the public and private sectors who are involved either in trying to keep public services going or grow the economy, and there's no animosity towards Scotland. The view, not quite unanimously, but overwhelmingly, is go for it, go and do it. Make things better for your own people and show us what you can do, and then maybe with some more power we'll be able to do the same.
Is there a perfect model for government, since you study the subject?
No, of course there isn't. No,
a benign monarchy or something,
well, no, I'm quite fond of Churchill's many quotes on the subject, and I think the one about democracy being the least bad form of government yet invented is probably quite good. But no, of course there isn't. But I'm also quite a believer in the idea that political pluralism is essential to a well-functioning democracy. And one of the other opportunities that independence brings to Scotland is a chance for us to look at our own country and its regions and think about how we distribute opportunity and power better. And that's not about devolving the work programme.
No.
Especially not about devolving the work programme to a set of local authorities that were designed by the Tories to try and compete with one another.
Yeah.
That's about thinking about how Scotland should be best governed at a community level, which regions have got distinctive needs that we need to think about more appropriately, and that's a really creative process, which is just starting.
Well, it is. The trouble is, as soon as you say local government reorganisation, everybody's eyes glaze over you. So you need to find a new way of thinking.
Exactly, but it's got to be a lot more about that. It's not the technical exercise of trying to redraw the boundaries and reallocating a few desks and a few jobs from one area to the other. It's about thinking about what the proper allocation of powers and money, of course, is between different parts of Scotland, in the same way that we're having an argument about whether and why it's better to allocate revenues and to govern differently in Scotland as opposed to at the UK level.
Just bringing it on to the issue though, if there is a yes, if for example an SNP based government was re-elected, I mean, I'm not sure there's much sign from the current administration of a desire to move into that whole area of powers devolved to, beyond Edinburgh into local communities, is there?
I don't think there's been much thinking done about that from anybody, to be quite honest, and I think that's partly because we've inherited a system of local government which is really quite weak. It's hard to look across Scotland and point to either a jurisdiction, a local authority, or even a local authority leader that's really able to influence the Scottish national political debate in the way that you would be able to point in different countries. And to me, that's something that we really have to do something about. And for me, one of the important things about a yes vote is that to maintain that kind of political pluralism, which is about a just distribution of power and resources across Scotland, we really need to think carefully about how we can invest power in organisations and institutions which are not the Scottish Parliament. And that's important at a community level, and it's important geographically because Scotland's actually quite a big country.
And very regionalised.
And very regionalised.
Areas,
so,
yeah.
It's incumbent on all of us, I think, to think all of those questions through very carefully.
Just lastly, how's this campaign going, do you think? What's your assessment of it?
I think I would agree with the realisation which has come to many people in the last couple of weeks in particular, that this really is quite a celebration of democracy. You see people having conversations about politics in a way that I was about to say that I haven't seen in my lifetime. That's probably true, but certainly since the 80s, when there was still a real ideological difference between the UK parties, it was meaningful in some respects. So, the fact that this debate is happening at all, the fact that it's happening with, the vibrancy that it clearly is, and the fact that it really is happening in a kind of civic and democratic way is absolutely remarkable. And I wonder sometimes about whether we'll look back in 2014 in the same way that we look back in 1989, and you can see maybe something interesting is about to happen in Scotland. Something interesting might be about to happen in Catalonia, and maybe in 10 or 20 years' time we'll look back and think, well, that was one of those moments when democracy really did reappear again, and we'll be all the better for it.